You know, when I think of Gogol, I always imagine the endless Ukrainian steppes, the scent of flowering cherry orchards, and quiet evenings when an ancient song can be heard somewhere in the distance. This is because it was from there, from the very heart of Poltavshchina, that this amazing man emerged into the great world. On the 1st of April, 1809, in the small village of Veliki Sorochintsy, a boy who was destined to overturn all of Russian literature was born into a family of impoverished nobles. He was named Nikolai. Imagine that time. Napoleon was only preparing for his campaign against Russia. The empire was living a relatively quiet life, and somewhere on the outskirts of this enormous country, in the Ukrainian heartland, the future genius was coming into the world. The Gogol-Yanovsky family was typical for that time, neither rich nor poor, just middle-status landowners. The father, Vasily Afanasyevich, was an unusual person. He did not merely manage the estate, he wrote plays, organized home performances, and loved the theater with all his soul. Can you imagine how rare this was for a provincial landowner? In those times, most nobles were more interested in hunting and cards, yet here were theatrical productions, literature, and creative work. This love for art was, of course, passed on to his son. His mother, Maria Ivanovna, was the complete opposite of her husband. A deeply religious, devout woman, she married very young. Imagine she was only 14 years old when she became a wife, and she dedicated her entire life to faith and family. They say she was very superstitious, believing in omens and prophetic dreams. And you know, this mystical quality of hers, this sense of the presence of something otherworldly in ordinary life, all of this would later resonate in the works of her son. Little Nikolai's childhood was spent on the Vasilivka estate. It was a typical Ukrainian manor, a white house with a garden, ponds, fields, and peasant huts nearby. It was a world that lived by its own laws, where Christianity and ancient pagan beliefs intertwined, where every ravine had its own name and legend, and where old people told stories of witches and drowned maidens in the evenings. Just imagine, a boy is sitting somewhere on the porch ledge or hiding in the shade of a cherry orchard, listening to an old nurse or one of the house servants recount how the devil was seen in the neighboring village, or how a drowned lady comes out of the pond at night. For a child, these were not just fairy tales, they were reality, a living world full of wonders and horrors. It was precisely these impressions, these stories heard in childhood, that would later form the basis of Evenings on a Farm Near Dikanka. Gogol did not invent his fantastic world. He simply recounted what he had absorbed from his mother's milk, what he had heard in his native land. Ukrainian folklore was incredibly rich in those days. Now we can read these fairy tales and legends in books, but back then, all of it existed in oral tradition, passed down from generation to generation. Songs about Cossacks, about love and betrayal, stories about wood spirits and house spirits, beliefs about how to ward off evil forces, all of this surrounded the child from birth. When Nikolai turned 10 years old, he was sent to study in Poltava at the district school. This was the first step from his native nest into the outside world. For a little boy from the village, Poltava seemed like a real city, although by metropolitan standards it was, of course, a provincial corner. But for him, it was the first acquaintance with a wider world, with other people, with a different life. The school was typical for that time: rote learning, strict teachers, state-owned classrooms. But it was there, among books and comrades, that the character of the future writer began to form. He was not the best student, nor did he shine with exceptional talents, but something already distinguished him from the others: a particular attentiveness to people, an ability to notice the funny and the strange. And then sorrow struck, leaving a mark on his entire life. Nikolai's younger brother died. The death of a loved one is always difficult, but for a child, it is an especially terrifying shock. It is said that precisely after this loss, the melancholy and anguish that would later permeate all his creative work settled in the boy's soul. He became more thoughtful, more serious, and began to read more and reflect more on life and death. This is how, among the Ukrainian fields and legends, surrounded by simple people with their stories and songs, in an atmosphere where the real mingled with the fantastic, the future great writer was formed. He did not yet know that he would become Gogol, that his name would enter the history of literature, that his evenings and the Inspector General would be read and staged centuries later. He was simply a boy from the Ukrainian heartland who listened to fairy tales and dreamed of something greater. After studying in Poltava, the family faced the question, what should be done next with Nikolai? And then an opportunity arose that seemed like a real stroke of luck. In the city of Nezhin, the Gymnasium of Higher Sciences opened, a new type of educational institution modeled after the Tsarskoye Selo Lyceum, where Pushkin once studied. Imagine the hopes that were tied to this gymnasium. It was presumed that it would become the center of enlightenment for all of Little Russia, and that educated, progressive people who would serve the good of the fatherland would emerge from it. In 1821, 12-year-old Nikolai Gogol crossed the threshold of this institution. To be honest, the reality was far removed from the rosy promises that accompanied the opening of the gymnasium. The teachers encountered were varied. There were talented people among them, but there were also plenty of mediocrities. The curriculum was extensive but not always well thought out. The discipline was strict, almost barracks-like. But do you know what is surprising? It was within these walls, despite all the system's shortcomings, that Gogol's true development began. The years he spent in Nezhin, from 12 to 19 years old, are the most important time in a person's life. This is the time when you stop being a child and become an adult, when character is formed, interests are defined, and true friends appear. And here, in this provincial gymnasium, far from the brilliance of the capital, Gogol found his people. He gained friends, true, loyal ones, with whom he would maintain relationships for many years. They were boys just like him, provincials, dreamers, romantics. They read voraciously everything they could get their hands on, debated literature and art, and made grand plans for the future. You know how it is in youth. It seems that you and your friends are capable of overturning the whole world, that great achievements and exploits await you. Gogol especially loved the theater. The gymnasium had its own student theater troupe, and Nikolai threw himself wholeheartedly into this endeavor. He didn't just act on stage, he was the soul of the entire undertaking. He played magnificently, especially in comedic roles and roles of old women. Imagine a frail teenager who immersed himself so deeply in the image of some quarrelsome old woman that the audience forgot they were watching a young man. He had a special gift, the ability to notice people's characteristic traits, their manners, intonations, and gestures, and then reproduce all of this on stage. The theatrical performances were not just entertainment for them, it was genuine art that they created with their own hands. They made scenery from improvised materials, sewed costumes, and rehearsed late into the night. And when the curtain went up, when the audience, teachers, comrades, sometimes invited guests from the town, began to applaud, it was true happiness. But the matter was not limited to theater. In the gymnasium, as in many educational institutions of that time, students published handwritten journals. This was common practice. The boys bound sheets, wrote articles, poems, and stories by hand, drew pictures, and then this homemade journal was passed from hand to hand, read, and discussed. Gogol actively participated in these publications. He wrote poems, though to be honest, his poetry wasn't very good, rather mediocre and imitative. He wrote prose, small sketches and reflections. He tried his hand at journalism. It was a time of great romantic dreams. The era following the War of 1812, after the victory over Napoleon, was special. Ideas of service to the fatherland, civic duty, and high destiny were floating in the air. Young people devoured romantic literature, German romantics, Byron, and early Pushkin. The Decembrist revolt had just taken place in Russia, and although it was suppressed, the spirit of freedom and the striving for justice still lived in the hearts of young people. Gogol dreamed of how he would serve Russia, how he would benefit society. He didn't yet know exactly how that would be, perhaps in civil service, perhaps in art, perhaps in some other way. But this desire to be useful, to do something important for the country, burned brightly within him. He read extensively, reflecting on the fate of Russia, its unique path, and what it ought to be. Gradually, year after year, a creative personality was formed in this thin, somewhat withdrawn young man. He already understood that he possessed a special gift, the ability to see right through people, to notice their funny and tragic sides, and to convey this through words or on stage. His comrades recognized his talent, although few could have predicted then that one of the greatest Russian writers would emerge from their midst. The years at the gymnasium flew by unnoticed. The year 1828 arrived, the time of graduation. The question arose before 19-year-old Gogol, what next? And he made the decision that seemed to him the only correct one, to go to St. Petersburg, the capital, northern Palmyra, the city where everything boils and bubbles, where careers are made, where fame and recognition can be achieved. You know how it is with young provincials? A completely fantastic image of the capital forms in their minds. It seems that you only have to arrive, and you will immediately be noticed, appreciated, that doors will open by themselves, and that success will be immediate. Gogol made grandiose plans. He carried manuscripts with him, hoping to quickly secure a position in civil service, perhaps even to have an acting career. He believed that St. Petersburg was the place where dreams come true. He had a little money in his pocket, which his mother had scraped together with difficulty, a modest provincial wardrobe, and his literary attempts in his suitcase, and in his soul, an enormous faith in himself and his destiny. He was saying goodbye to friends, to his native places, to those years of youth that would never return. Ahead lay St. Petersburg, a great life, and fame. That is how it seemed to him. He did not yet suspect that reality would turn out to be completely different, that the capital would meet him coldly and indifferently. But that is already another story. In December of 1828, a train brought the young Gogol to St. Petersburg. December in the northern capital is a special time. Short gray days, when it gets dark as early as 3 o'clock in the afternoon, a penetrating wind from the Neva, dampness, and a cold that creeps under your clothes. For a person raised under the warm Ukrainian sky, this was the first test, but the weather did not turn out to be the hardest part. St. Petersburg met the provincial youth completely differently than he had dreamed. You know, there is this cruel saying, the capital is indifferent to the dreams of newcomers. And Gogol encountered this indifference face to face. An enormous city where dozens, if not hundreds, of similar young people with burning eyes and great hopes arrive every day. And the city doesn't even notice them. It continues to live its own life, cold and majestic. The money his mother had given him was melting away at a frightening speed. St. Petersburg was an expensive city, and Nikolai had neither connections nor patronage, nor the experience that helps one survive in the capital. He rented a cheap room somewhere on the outskirts, economized on everything, but the funds still ran out. It was urgent to find some source of income, to get a job in civil service. But how does a provincial achieve this without connections? He went around to departments, wrote petitions, trying to get hired anywhere at all. Doors closed one after another. Recommendations and acquaintances were needed everywhere, and he had none of them. Officials looked at him as if he were nobody, waved him off, promised to think about it, and nothing happened. It was humiliating and difficult. His youthful pride suffered, but there was nowhere to retreat. He tried to break into the theater. After all, he had acting talent. He shone on stage at the gymnasium, but the capital's theater figures didn't even want to listen to him. A provincial amateur? No, thank you, we have enough of our own actors. And again, a closed door. Then Gogol decided on a desperate move. He did have a manuscript, a romantic poem that he had written while still in the gymnasium. It was called Hans Kuckelgarten. He put his entire youthful soul and all his romantic dreams into it. The hero of the poem, a young German idealist, pines away in the quiet province, dreams of great achievements, and sets off to seek happiness in the greater world. Was this not a reflection of his own feelings? In the summer of 1829, the poem was published. Gogol didn't even dare to use his real name. He signed it with the pseudonym V. Alov. He probably felt somewhere deep down that it was not a masterpiece and feared failure. And failure was not long in coming. Critics, if they noticed the book by the unknown author at all, responded extremely coldly. The poem was genuinely weak, imitative, naive, and full of romantic cliches. It contained nothing of the Gogol we know. For a young man with a sensitive soul, this was a terrible blow. Imagine, you put forth your most cherished work for public judgment, and they don't even really criticize you, they simply don't notice you. This is worse than negative reviews. It is complete indifference. And then Gogol committed an act that says a lot about his character. He used his last money to buy up all the copies of his poem that remained in the bookstores and burned them. He simply took them and destroyed them, as if erasing this defeat from his biography. And then he did something quite strange. In July of the same year, he suddenly left for Germany. He just took off and left, without truly explaining the reasons to anyone. To this day, it is not exactly known what prompted this step. Perhaps he wanted to escape from failure, from that oppressive feeling of defeat? Or perhaps there was some romantic story, an unhappy love. Gogol was always secretive, keeping much to himself. He did not stay long in Germany, literally just a few weeks, and then returned to St. Petersburg. He had almost no money left, and his situation worsened. But sometimes just when it seems things couldn't get any worse, life takes a turn for the better. Gogol did manage to secure a position in civil service after all, in the Department of Appanages. It was a modest clerical post with a small salary, routine paperwork, and the gray everyday life of the St. Petersburg Chancery. But it was money, it was stability, and what was more important, it was material for observation. He saw from the inside this bureaucratic machine, these minor officials with their passions and vices, their small tragedies and comedies. All of this would later be reflected in his works. Gradually, life began to improve. Through acquaintances, he began to make his way into St. Petersburg literary circles. And this is where everything changed. He met Vasily Zhukovsky, a famous poet, the mentor of the heir to the throne himself. Zhukovsky was a person of extraordinary kindness. He always helped young talents. He saw something special in this provincial man and took him under his patronage. Through Zhukovsky, Gogol met Pyotr Pletnyov, a poet, critic, and professor. And then the meeting occurred that became one of the most important in his life. Zhukovsky introduced him to Alexander Pushkin. Pushkin, the greatest poet of the era, a genius whose poems all educated Russia knew by heart. For Gogol, it was like meeting a living legend. And what is surprising, Pushkin treated the young writer with sincere interest and warmth. They talked and found common ground. Pushkin turned out to be easy to talk to, without arrogance, with a lively mind and a kind heart. These acquaintances opened a new world before Gogol. He became accepted in literary salons. He began to be taken seriously. Another opportunity also arose. He was offered a position as a history teacher at the Patriotic Institute, a closed educational institution for young ladies. History had always interested Gogol, and he enthusiastically took up teaching. True, he turned out not to be a very good teacher. He got too carried away, talked about his own things, sometimes fantasized and embellished facts. But it was a job that provided some income and left him time for literary creation. Thus, through the pain of failures and humiliations, through poverty and disappointment, Gogol gradually felt his way in this cold and indifferent city. St. Petersburg still hadn't truly accepted him, but had stopped pushing him away. Doors began to open slightly. Real recognition lay ahead, but for that, he needed to find his own voice, his own theme, and he found it where he came from, in the Ukrainian legends and stories of his childhood. After all the St. Petersburg failures and disappointments, Gogol understood one simple thing. There was no need to try to write the way others wrote, no need to imitate romantic models. One must write about what one truly knows, what one feels with all one's soul. And he turned to what had lived within him since childhood, to Ukraine, to its legends, to the stories he had once heard in his native Vasilivka. Imagine, he sits in his modest St. Petersburg room. Outside the window is a gray northern day, dampness and cold, and he is writing about warm Ukrainian evenings, about lads, parubki, and maidens, divchini, about witches and devils, about Dikanka with its cheerful fairs. He is as if returning to childhood, hearing again the voices of those who told him these stories, and amazingly, the words flowed by themselves, easily and naturally. He worked with extraordinary inspiration. This was no longer the forced romantic poem that reeked of imitation. This was his own voice, his own world. Every detail, every description was filled with life, because he remembered, saw, and felt all of it. By the autumn of 1831, the manuscript for the first part was ready. He named the book Evenings on a Farm Near Dikanka. The title itself already sounded somehow homey, cozy, not a pompous romantic poem, but simply evenings when people gather together and tell each other stories. The book was released in September. And then what Gogol could not even have dreamed of after the failure of Hans Kuckelgarten happened. The success was instantaneous and deafening. St. Petersburg, which had ignored the provincial official for so long, suddenly started talking about the new book. It was read in salons, discussed, quoted, people laughed at the cheerful scenes, and admired the vivid descriptions. Do you know what most struck the readers? In Russian literature of those years, Romanticism reigned with its sublime heroes, exotic countries, and high passions. And then suddenly, a simple Ukrainian village, ordinary peasants, lads, girls, deacons, Cossacks. And yet it was written so vividly, so brightly, with such humor and warmth that it was impossible to put down. It was a fresh wind in literature, something completely new. But the most important thing for Gogol was the review from the person whose opinion meant the most to him. Pushkin read Evenings and was delighted. He wrote that it was genuine merriment, sincere, unfeigned, without affectation. He praised Gogol's humor, his ability to see the comical in ordinary life. Imagine what those words meant to the young writer. Pushkin himself, the greatest poet of the era, acknowledged his talent. Inspired by the success, Gogol set about writing the continuation. The second part of Evenings was published in the following year, 1832, and it was met with no less enthusiasm. Now all of reading Russia knew Gogol's name. What was so special about these evenings? Why did they captivate readers so much? The fact is that Gogol created an utterly amazing artistic world, where the real intertwined with the fantastic in the most natural way. Here is a lad going on a date with a girl, an ordinary life story. And along the way, he meets a devil or a witch, and this too is perceived as something quite commonplace. Because for the people Gogol wrote about, evil spirits were as much a reality as neighbors or livestock. At the same time, he did not descend into dark mysticism. His devils were more comical characters, malicious, tricky, but ultimately foolish. They could be deceived, outsmarted, or even simply beaten up. This was folk fantasy, cheerful and mischievous, not the gothic horror of European romantics. Gogol's humor was special, kind, yet pointed. He noticed people's funny characteristics, their weaknesses and oddities, but he did so without malice. The reader laughed not at the characters, but with them, recognizing something humanly understandable and close in their actions. And what descriptions of nature, of Ukrainian landscapes, Gogol wrote in such a way that the reader seemed to see those endless steppes, quiet ponds, and white huts in the cherry orchards. And yet the descriptions were not dry. They were full of lyricism, a warm feeling for his native land. The Ukrainian folklore he utilized was not merely material for plots. It was a living element of folk culture, with its own language, its own imagery, and its own worldview. Gogol showed Russian readers an entire world about which they previously knew almost nothing. Ukraine, as depicted by him, was not just the outskirts of the empire, but a land with the richest culture, a distinctive national character, and unique local flavor. And yet, this is what is important. He did not turn all this into an ethnographic curiosity. His Ukrainian lads and maidens were living people with real feelings. They loved, were jealous, rejoiced, and grieved, just like people everywhere and always. It's just that all of this occurred within the distinctive, vivid backdrop of Ukrainian daily life. St. Petersburg literary circles opened their arms to Gogol. Now he was received not as a provincial failure, but as a rising star of Russian letters. He was greeted with joy in the salons and asked to read his works aloud. And he read magnificently, with the intonations and acting skill that he had honed back in the gymnasium. Listeners burst into laughter or froze when he reached the frightening parts. It was then that he met the young critic Vissarion Belinsky. This was an important acquaintance. In those years, Belinsky was just beginning his path as a literary critic, who would later be called the Furious. He immediately saw in Gogol a great writer, a new voice in Russian literature. True, a terrible break would occur between them later, but that would be many years later. For now, everything was turning out perfectly. From a failure and a pauper who did not know how he would live the next day, Gogol transformed into an acknowledged writer. He started earning money from book publishing, was invited to the best houses, and was taken seriously. He proved to himself and others that he had not come to St. Petersburg in vain, that his dreams of literary fame were not youthful fantasy, but the premonition of a true vocation. But most importantly, he found himself. He understood what and how he needed to write, and this was only the beginning. Evenings on a Farm was the first great success, but even more significant works awaited him. After the success of Evenings, Gogol faced a choice: continue writing cheerful Ukrainian stories, which were fashionable, or move forward, looking for something new, and he chose the latter. Because a true artist cannot stand still, repeating himself. It was necessary to grow, to delve deeper, to seek new themes and forms. And here he turned his attention to St. Petersburg itself, the city that had once met him so cruelly, a city of contrasts and paradoxes, of grandeur and destitution. During his years in the capital, he had seen enough of it, learned its underbelly, its dark corners, its strange phantom essence. And he began writing the St. Petersburg tales. Nevsky Prospect became, in a sense, the opening of this cycle. The capital's main street, the ceremonial shop window of the empire. What could seem more brilliant, more festive? But Gogol showed that behind this brilliance lay deception, vulgarity, and tragedy. Two friends stroll along Nevsky, both becoming captivated by beautiful strangers. One, a romantic artist, mistakes a woman of easy virtue for an ideal of purity, and this ends in his madness and destruction. The other, a vulgar officer, calmly flirts with someone else's wife and just as calmly forgets the adventure. And this contrast, this bitter irony, the romantic perishes while the vulgar man prospers, pierces to the heart. Diary of a Madman is something special altogether. A petty official whom no one notices, who copies papers and endures mockery, gradually goes insane. And there is a terrible logic to his madness. He falls in love with his superior's daughter, a beauty who lives in a completely different world. Of course, to her, he is simply nobody. And then his mind begins to defend itself against this unbearable reality. creating its own world where he is the king of Spain, where he is significant and important. You read these notes and realize, madness here is not a medical diagnosis, but a way to escape the cruelty of a world where one person means nothing to another. And the portrait is a reflection on the nature of art and artistic talent. A young artist buys a strange portrait, and this portrait brings him wealth but destroys his talent. Money, success, commissions from wealthy clients, and parallel to this, the true artist within him dies. Gogol himself experienced this temptation, to write what sells easily, what the public likes, or to seek his own path, even if it is difficult. Well, the nose is pure grotesque, a phantasmagoria. Imagine, an official's nose disappears, and this nose begins to live a separate life, traveling around the city in the uniform of a high rank. And the funniest part is, everyone treats the nose with greater reverence than its former owner, because the nose has a higher rank. This is brilliant satire on reverence for rank, on how in St. Petersburg people value a person's place in the table of ranks, not the person himself. Parallel to the St. Petersburg tales, Gogol worked on the collection Mirgorod, which was released in 1835. This was a return to Ukrainian themes, but in a completely different key. If evenings were cheerful and mischievous, Mirgorod turned out to be more serious, more profound. Old World Landowners is a bright, touching story about an elderly couple who live their entire lives together on their quiet estate. They eat jam, tend the garden, and live in their small, cozy world. And then the old woman dies, and the old man cannot live without her, wastes away, and soon follows her. It seems like nothing special, an ordinary story. But it is written with such warmth, with such tenderness, that the reader weeps over these simple people and their simple happiness. Taras Bulba is an entirely different matter. It is an epic, a truly heroic tale about the Zaporozhian Cossacks, about battles, about freedom, about the time when people lived by the harsh laws of brotherhood and honor. Old Cossack Taras and his sons, feats of valor and betrayal, love and duty, all of this unfolds on a broad historical canvas. Gogol wrote this tale with special inspiration, as if singing the praises of his people's heroic past. Vi returned readers to mysticism and horror, but what a level. The story of a seminarian who reads prayers over the body of a witch for 3 nights, and on the 3rd night the terrible Vi appears. This is genuine horror that gives you goosebumps. And yet it is written in such a way that you believe every word. And the tale of how Ivan Ivanovich quarreled with Ivan Nikiforovich is already a different intonation. 2 friends, 2 landowners, live side by side in perfect harmony. And suddenly they quarrel over some stupidity, over a trifle. And this quarrel drags on for years, turns into a meaningless lawsuit, and destroys both of them. Yet, once they were friends. And the ending of the tale is one of the saddest in Gogol. It's dull in this world, gentlemen. Thus, through a seemingly comical story, a deep sorrow about the meaninglessness of existence, about how people destroy themselves, breaks through. But the main event of those years was the work on the comedy The Inspector General, Revizor. They say that Pushkin himself suggested the plot to Gogol. Pushkin told him a story about how a man arrived in the province and was mistaken for an important official from the capital. And Gogol seized upon this idea. He understood that this was ideal material for a comedy that would expose all the sores of provincial officialdom. He wrote The Inspector General with passion, even with malice. All these bribe-takers, fools, and grasping individuals, he saw them, knew them, and understood them to the core. The mayor, who steals right and left himself, the judge, who keeps geese in the courtroom, the postmaster, who opens other people's letters out of curiosity, and they all tremble before a possible inspection, before the highest authority. And then they mistake the empty St. Petersburg fop, Klestakov, who doesn't understand what is happening himself but gladly exploits the situation, for the inspector. In the spring of 1836, the premiere took place at the Alexandrinsky Theater. Emperor Nicholas I himself attended the performance, and that's when it began. The comedy had the effect of an exploding bomb. Officials saw it as an insult to the entire state apparatus. The emperor, however, laughed and said, "Everyone got their share, and I got the most of all." But that did little to help. Reviews poured in, varied and contradictory. Some admired the author's boldness, while others accused him of libel against Russia, of exaggerating vices, and of excessive harshness. Disputes flared up in the theater after every performance. Some gave a standing ovation, others booed. Gogol took this incredibly hard. His sensitive, vulnerable nature could not withstand such intensity of passions. He expected to be understood correctly, that the comedy would be seen not as a malicious caricature, but as an attempt to reform morals through laughter. Instead, a barrage of criticism fell upon him. Friends tried to support him, but he felt misunderstood and insulted. And then he made a decision that would determine his life for many years to come: to leave Russia, to go abroad. He needed rest from this harassment, from the misunderstanding, and to gather strength for new work. He dreamed of a quiet life somewhere in Italy, of the possibility of working calmly on his main design, the poem Dead Souls. In the summer of the same year, he left St. Petersburg. He did not know then that he would not return to Russia soon, that long years of wandering across Europe lay ahead. In June of 1836, Gogol left Russia. He departed with a heavy heart, as if running away from something. After the whole story with the Inspector General, after the misunderstanding and criticism, he needed to breathe, distance himself, and look at everything from the side. But there was another reason. He carried with him the design that was meant to become the main work of his life. Even before his departure, during one of their meetings, Pushkin told him a plot which he himself had wanted to use but decided to give to his friend. The story was simple and brilliant at the same time. A man travels across Russia buying up dead souls, that is, deceased peasants who are still registered as living in the census records. Why? To mortgage them as if they were alive and obtain money. A scheme, a fraud, but what scope it offered for depicting all of Russia, all its types and characters. Gogol became inspired by this idea. He understood that this was not just a comedic plot for a cheerful story. It was an opportunity to create a panorama of Russian life, to show the country in all its complexity, with all its vices and merits. It would be a poem. That is what he decided to call his work, although he intended to write in prose. A poem about Russia, about its soul, about its fate. The first point of his European journey was Switzerland. Mountains, clean air, silence. It seemed like an ideal place for work. But Gogol quickly realized that this measured, proper Swiss life was not for him. Too quiet, too clean, too correct. He lacked powerful impressions, the bubbling life that nourished his creativity. Then came Paris, the capital of the world, a city where cultural life boiled, where great writers, artists, and musicians lived and created. Paris in the 30s of the 19th century was the era of Romanticism. It meant Victor Hugo, George Sand, theaters, and salons. But Paris did not appeal to Gogol either. French life seemed to him somehow superficial, too rational, lacking the depth and irrationality that he loved. And then he arrived in Rome. And here a miracle happened. He fell in love with this city at first sight. Rome became his second home, the place where he would spend most of the following years. What was it that attracted him so much to the Eternal City? You see, Rome is not just a beautiful city with ancient ruins. It is a place where time flows differently. Here, the past lives alongside the present. You walk along the street, and around you are ruins 2,000 years old, Renaissance cathedrals, and Baroque fountains. History here is not an abstraction from a textbook. It is everywhere. It is tangible. And for Gogol, with his heightened sense of historical time, this was the ideal place. Moreover, There was a Russian colony in Rome, artists, writers, just travelers. It was possible to communicate with compatriots, speak Russian, and discuss news from home. But at the same time, you were far away from St. Petersburg intrigues and gossip, from literary struggles and criticism. There was the distance necessary for work, and the climate. After cold, damp St. Petersburg, after the raw Russian weather, here was warm sun, blue sky, and soft air. Gogol was always sickly, felt cold, and caught colds. But here he felt better, freer. He rented a modest apartment, woke up early, and worked for hours on Dead Souls. The work proceeded slowly, agonizingly. He wrote, crossed out, and rewrote entirely. Every phrase had to be precise, every detail verified. He was not simply creating an entertaining story, he was creating a living world. Gradually, a gallery of Russian landowners was born, so different, yet so recognizable. Maniloff with his sweet dreams and complete inability to act. Korobochka, thrifty to the point of stinginess, who haggles over every penny. Rowdy Nozdryov, eternally drunk, always in fights and scandals. Gloomy accumulator Plyushkin, who turned into a living ruin amidst piles of junk. Each of them is a type, an abstraction, yet also a living person with his own peculiarities. And at the center of it all, Pavel Ivanovich Chichikov, a mysterious character who arrives in the provincial town and begins to buy up dead souls. He is courteous, polite, and knows how to be pleasing. But what is in his soul? Who is he? A villain, an adventurer, or simply a product of his time, a man who plays by the rules of the society he lives in? Gogol intended to show how Chichikov travels to the landowners, how he conducts negotiations with each one, adjusting to the character of his interlocutor. With Maniloff he is sweet and amiable, with Korobochka patient and persistent, with Nozdryov cautious. Through these meetings, through these dialogues, all of Russia is revealed, its customs, its problems, its absurdity. Working on the poem required complete immersion. Gogol lived inside his work. He saw his characters so clearly, as if they actually existed. He heard their voices, knew their habits, and at the same time he understood that he was writing not merely a satire, not just an exposé of vices. He was writing about the Russia he loved, despite all its flaws. Parallel to Dead Souls, he returned to his old works, revising them. The Inspector General was significantly reworked. New scenes were added and characters were deepened. The portrait also went through serious revision. Gogol was a perfectionist. It always seemed to him that he could write better, more accurately, more profoundly. And then, in January of 1837, news arrived that shook him to the core. Pushkin had died in a duel. The man who had supported him at the start of his path, who had gifted him the plot for the Inspector General in Dead Souls, who was not just a literary authority but a true friend to him, was gone. Gogol was 37 years old, and he lost the man who had been a guiding star for him. He wrote desperate letters to his friends, full of grief. Pushkin's death was perceived by him as a personal loss, as a catastrophe for all of Russian literature. Who would set the tone now? Who would inspire? Who would support? This grief amplified his feeling of loneliness and responsibility. Now he had to continue the work that the great predecessors had begun. From time to time, Gogol returned to Russia, for a short time, for a few months. He needed to see friends, family, and feel his native soil beneath his feet. After all, he was writing about Russia, and it was essential for him not to lose touch with it, not to turn into an emigrant detached from reality. During these visits, he met with writers, discussed his work, and read chapters from Dead Souls. Friends were delighted and predicted tremendous success. But Gogol was in no hurry to publish. It seemed to him that it was not ready yet, that it needed revision and refinement. Gradually, some change began to take place in his mood. His religious feelings, which had always been present in him, as he was raised by a devout mother, intensified. But now this was becoming something more than just personal faith. He began to ponder the destiny of literature, whether it should only entertain and expose, or whether it had a higher mission, to teach, to instruct, to lead toward good. These thoughts had not yet fully crystallized. They were only beginning deep within his soul. But they were already there, these seeds of the future crisis that would overturn his life and work. For now, however, he worked on the first volume of Dead Souls, putting his entire soul and all his strength into this work. He believed that he was creating something great, that this book would be his main contribution to Russian literature. And he was right. But the price of this being right would turn out to be incredibly high. 6 years. Imagine, a full 6 years Gogol worked on the first volume of Dead Souls. He wrote, rewrote, threw out entire chapters, and started over. It was forced labor, exhausting both physically and mentally. But finally, the book was ready. In the spring of 1842, the poem was published, and what one could only dream of happened. The success was deafening, incredible. The book was instantly bought up, reissued, and read voraciously. In salons, taverns, educational institutions. Everywhere people talked about Chichikov and his adventures, quoted entire pages by heart, and argued about the characters as if they were real people. Do you know what especially struck the readers? The recognizability. Everyone saw in these landowners and these officials real people from their own circles. There's Manilov, why that's our neighbor, and Sobakovich, the spitting image of such and such a landowner. Nozdryov, there are plenty of such drunks and scandalmongers in every district. Gogol seemed to hold up a mirror to Russia, and Russia saw itself, in all its comicality, absurdity, and in places, tragic nature. Vissarion Belinsky, the main critic of the time, wrote an enthusiastic review. He called Dead Souls an encyclopedia of Russian life. Reflect on those words, an encyclopedia. That is, a work in which all of Russia, all its types, and all its problems are reflected. Belinsky admired the accuracy of Gogol's observations, the depth of his social analysis, and his artistic mastery. However, arguments immediately began. What was this book really about? Was it a satire on serfdom and officialdom, or was it something more? Why did Gogol call it a poem, even though it was written in prose? And what did that strange title, Dead Souls, mean? After all, it is not just about the deceased peasants whom Chichikov buys up. It is about the souls of living people who are spiritually dead, mired in vulgarity, greed, and pettiness. Gogol's laughter turned out to be special. Something sad, almost tragic, emerged through it. The reader laughed at the absurdities of provincial life, at Korobotchka's stupidity or Nozdryov's boasting, but then suddenly noticed that bitterness was hidden behind this laughter. Laughter through tears. That is what it was. And this is where the most interesting and most tragic part begins. It seemed that Gogol had reached the pinnacle of recognition. He was famous, his name resounded, and critics placed him alongside the greatest writers. He could have rested on his laurels and continued writing in the same vein. But instead, a painful crisis began to unfold in his soul. He immersed himself more and more in religious reflections. More frequently, he thought about the meaning of literature, about its purpose. Was it enough simply to show vices, to laugh at stupidity and vulgarity? Shouldn't a writer point the way to correction, show the ideal, and lead the reader toward good? Do you understand what the problem was? The first volume of Dead Souls is a brilliant satire, a gallery of negative types. But where is the positive element? Where are the heroes who can be imitated, who can be looked up to? And Gogol decided that the second volume should become the answer to these questions. He conceived a grandiose 3-part composition modeled after Dante's Inferno, Purgatorio, and Paradiso. The first volume is the hell of Russian reality. The second was supposed to show the path of purification, the appearance of positive heroes, honest officials, virtuous landowners, people who serve Russia not out of fear, but out of conscience. And the third volume, that was supposed to be the transfiguration, the revival, the triumph of good and justice. A beautiful concept, isn't it? But here was the trouble. It proved incredibly difficult to embody. Negative types were born easily and naturally for Gogol. He saw them around him, knew their habits, and heard their speech. But how does one create a living, positive hero who would not be a walking virtue, a cardboard figure? He began working on the second volume even before the publication of the first. He wrote, tore up, and wrote again. He read individual chapters to friends. They were delighted, assuring him that it was turning out magnificently. But Gogol himself felt something was wrong, something wasn't working. His positive characters came out less lively, less convincing than the negative ones. And parallel to this creative crisis, a spiritual crisis grew. Gogol began to see literature not as art, but as a sermon. It seemed to him that a writer should be a teacher, an instructor, almost a prophet. That it was not enough just to write well, one needed to lead the reader toward moral perfection. He spent more and more time in prayers and reading religious literature. He traveled to holy sites. He communicated with priests, seeking spiritual guidance. And the deeper he immersed himself in religious experiences, the harder artistic work became for him. A painful split was occurring. On one side, the artist's gift, which demanded expression and pushed him toward creativity. On the other, a religious consciousness that began to perceive literature as something sinful, as an indulgence of vanity and pride. Is it possible to serve God through art, or does art lead away from God? Friends saw how he was changing and became alarmed. The lively, witty, ironic Gogol they had known was gradually transforming into some gloomy ascetic, obsessed with the idea of moral improvement. He started talking more about sins, about repentance, and about saving the soul. Work on the second volume became heavier and heavier. What previously came easily, vivid images, lively dialogues, rich descriptions, now required incredible effort. He rewrote the same thing 10 times, yet still remained dissatisfied. It seemed to him that he was failing the task, that he could not create the ideal images that were supposed to show Russia the path to revival. And this internal conflict between the artist and the preacher, between art and religion, between gift and duty, began to destroy him from within. He did not yet fully realize what this would lead to, but the seeds of tragedy had already been sown. The triumph of dead souls turned into not joy for Gogol, but a heavy burden. He had raised the bar so high that now even greater things were expected of him, and he expected it of himself. But the more he tried, the higher he set his goals, the harder it became to achieve them. Ahead lay years of agonizing searching, doubt, and despair, and a finale that would become one of the most tragic pages in Russian literature. 5 years passed after the triumph of Dead Souls. 5 years of agonizing work on the second volume, 5 years of spiritual searching and internal struggle, and so, at the beginning of 1847, Gogol decided on a step that overturned his life and burned all bridges with his former circle. He published the book Selected Passages from Correspondence with Friends. It was a collection of his letters, reflections, and instructions, something halfway between a confession, a sermon, and journalism. Gogol poured his entire soul into this book, all his thoughts about Russia, about faith, about how life should be ordered. He sincerely believed that he was writing something important, that his words would help people and point out the right path. But what was a sincere impulse for him turned into a catastrophe in the eyes of his readers. The book had the effect of an exploding bomb, only with a minus sign. If Gogol had previously been extolled as an exposer of vices, as a bold satirist, now he appeared in a completely different light. He preached humility, and not just Christian humility before God, but the humility of everyone before their place in life. A peasant must be resigned to being a peasant, a landowner to being a landowner, an official to his rank. There is no need to strive to change the order of things, no need to rebel. One must perform one's duty in the place where the Lord has put you. He wrote about patriarchalism, about how beautiful the old ways were, when the landowner was a father to his peasants and the peasants were his children, when everyone knew their place and lived in harmony, in love for one another. This was a glorification of the very serfdom that progressive people in Russia considered the country's greatest disgrace and the source of all ills. Moreover, he justified serfdom. He said that the Russian people were not yet ready for freedom, and that if released, chaos and disintegration would begin. That serfdom relations were a protection for the common person, a concern for them. That landowners should be stricter and fairer, but the system itself was right and pleasing to God. Imagine what those felt who saw Gogol as their ally in the fight against social vices. This was not just disappointment, it was a sense of betrayal. How could this be? The man who created the Inspector General, a devastating satire on officialdom, who in Dead Souls showed all the rot of landowning Russia, suddenly begins to preach submission and defend what he had exposed? Liberal circles perceived the book as a slap in the face. Devastating reviews poured in. Gogol was accused of backwardness, of apostasy from former ideals, and of serving the authorities. People said he had lost his mind, that life abroad had detached him from reality, that he had turned into a fanatic and obscurantist. But the most terrible blow was delivered by Vissarion Belinsky, the very critic who had once called Dead Souls the encyclopedia of Russian life, who had extolled Gogol's talent. He wrote a letter, furious, merciless, scorching. This letter became one of the most famous documents of Russian social thought. Belinsky wrote that Gogol did not understand his own people, did not understand Russia, that preaching humility in a country where people are deprived of elementary rights is a crime, that serfdom is slavery, and no religious arguments can justify it. He accused Gogol of betraying his vocation and renouncing what made him a great writer. Belinsky's letter was so sharp, so furious, that it could not be officially printed. It circulated in copies, was transcribed by hand, and passed from person to person. And all progressive Russia read it and agreed. Gogol was condemned by those whom he considered his readers, his like-minded people. Even close friends recoiled from him. They could not understand what had happened to the man they knew and loved. They tried delicately to explain to him that he was wrong, that the book was a failure, that he should have thought before publishing. But for Gogol, this was not just a misunderstanding. It was a rejection of his very essence, his faith, his attempt to serve the good. He took this incredibly hard. His sensitive, ailing soul could not bear such a barrage of criticism and condemnation. It seemed to him that he had been betrayed, misunderstood, and that everyone had turned away from him. He tried to explain himself, writing replies, but this only worsened the situation. And then he decided on a desperate move, to go to Jerusalem, to the Holy Sepulchre. Perhaps there, in the Holy Land, he would find answers to the questions tormenting him. Maybe the pilgrimage would purify his soul, give him spiritual enlightenment, and point out the right path. At the beginning of 1848, he set off on his journey. The road was long and difficult, through Odessa, Constantinople, and then by sea to Palestine. He prayed, fasted, preparing for the encounter with the shrine as the greatest event of his life. But something went wrong. Jerusalem did not make the impression on him that he had hoped for. He stood by the Holy Sepulchre and did not feel the spiritual uplift, the revelation he was waiting for. Around him were crowds of pilgrims, stuffiness, heat, a kind of fuss. The holy places turned out to be just places, ancient, consecrated by prayer, but not giving him what he sought. This was a terrible disappointment. He hoped for a miracle, for transformation, but received only emptiness. He later wrote to friends that he felt somehow wooden, that he could not awaken in himself the feelings he should have experienced. and this intensified his despair. Did it mean he was so sinful, so far from God, that even a pilgrimage couldn't help? He returned from Jerusalem even more depressed than he had been before the trip. Depression was mounting. His physical health also deteriorated. Constant pain, weakness, insomnia, and most importantly, the creative crisis deepened. The second volume of Dead Souls was completely stalled. The work was going nowhere. Everything he undertook seemed unsuccessful, unworthy. He rushed back and forth between Russia and abroad, finding no peace anywhere. In Russia, he was haunted by the memories of the failure of selected passages, and abroad he felt detached from his native soil. He was lonely, unhappy, and entangled in his own contradictions. And very little time remained ahead, just a few years until the tragic outcome. After all his wanderings, after the disappointment in Jerusalem, after the break with liberal circles, Gogol returned to Russia. But this was no longer the triumphant return of an acknowledged writer, but rather the flight of an exhausted, sick man who sought some kind of peace and found it nowhere. He settled in Moscow. He had no house of his own, no corner of his own. He lived with friends, moving from one hospitable house to another. Count Alexander Tolstoy sheltered him, then he lived with Pogodin, then with the Aksakovs. Kind people welcomed him, cared for him, but he felt like a hanger-on, a burden, although no one ever made him feel that way. Moscow welcomed him warmly. Here he was still loved, valued, and respected. The scandal with selected passages was not perceived as sharply in patriarchal, more conservative Moscow as it was in liberal St. Petersburg. Here, he was seen primarily as a great writer, the author of Dead Souls and the Inspector General, and not as an apostate from progressive ideas. But Gogol himself could not find peace. His entire existence was now subordinate to a single goal, to finish the second volume of Dead Souls. This turned into an obsession, a mania. He had to prove to himself and everyone that he was capable of creating that continuation, which would show the path to Russia's revival, which would counterbalance the satire of the first volume with positive images. Every morning he sat down to work. He wrote slowly, agonizingly, squeezing out every phrase. What previously came easily and naturally, vivid images, lively dialogues, rich descriptions, now required incredible effort. He could work on a single chapter for weeks, then suddenly cross everything out and start anew. Do you know what the problem was? Negative types emerged on their own for him, lively, recognizable, three-dimensional. But the positive heroes came out somehow cardboard, unreal. The ideal landowner who justly manages his estate and cares for the peasants as if they were his children. The honest official who serves not out of fear but out of conscience. The virtuous woman who inspires those around her to do good deeds. All this sounded right but failed to come alive on the pages. He read the written chapters to friends. They gathered in a small circle, 5 or 6 of the closest people. Gogol read aloud, putting his entire soul, all his acting skill into it. And the friends were delighted. They said it was wonderful, that the second volume would be even better than the first, that Russia was eagerly awaiting the continuation. But he did not believe them. He saw in their eyes not so much admiration as pity and a desire to support him. He felt that what he had written did not measure up to the standard he had set for himself. And this was tormenting, to realize that his talent seemed to be drying up, that the gift which once seemed inexhaustible suddenly failed him at the most crucial moment. He rewrote chapters 10, sometimes 15 times. He changed episodes, rearranged passages, added new scenes, and discarded old ones. Stacks of scribbled paper grew, but there was no satisfaction. The more he worked, the further away the goal seemed. And parallel to this creative deadlock, the religious crisis deepened. The faith that had once been a pillar and a comfort gradually transformed into something gloomy and oppressive. Gogol spent more and more time in church, prayed for hours, and fasted so strictly that it harmed his already weak health. He sought answers to his questions in religion, but found only new doubts and fears. and then a man appeared in his life whose influence turned out to be fatal. Father Matvey Konstantinovsky, a priest, a confessor. Gogol turned to him for spiritual guidance, hoping to find a mentor who would help him sort out the chaos in his soul. But Father Matvey turned out to be a man of extreme views. He was convinced that imaginative literature was a sin, an idle occupation that distracted from the salvation of the soul, that all these invented stories, these images were from the evil one, that the only worthwhile reading was the Holy Scriptures and the lives of the saints, that Gogol should abandon literature and dedicate the remainder of his life to prayer and repentance. Imagine the state of a writer hearing this from his spiritual mentor. On one side, the gift he had lived by his whole life, which made him who he was. On the other, an authoritative priest says that this gift is sinful, that he must renounce it for the sake of his soul's salvation. Gogol was torn between these two poles. He could not just stop writing, that would have been a denial of himself, but neither could he ignore the words of his confessor, for he spoke in the name of the Church, in the name of God. This internal conflict destroyed him from within. His health deteriorated catastrophically. Constant headaches, stomach problems, insomnia. He ate almost nothing, exhausted himself with fasts. He lost so much weight that friends looked in horror at his drawn face, at his eyes burning with a feverish glare. Doctors shrugged their shoulders. Some of his illnesses were real, some imaginary, but altogether they undermined his vital strength. His mood grew gloomier and gloomier. He spoke of death, that he would soon die, that he would not have time to finish the main work of his life. He was seized by fits of despair when it seemed that everything was meaningless, that he had failed both as a writer and as a man. Sometimes there were moments of clarity, short periods when work went better, when his mood improved, when hope appeared. But then a dark wave of depression rolled in again, and he sank deeper and deeper into it. Friends tried to help. They urged him to take care of himself, not to work himself to exhaustion, to take his mind off things, to relax. But he did not listen. He was obsessed with the idea of finishing the second volume, proving his right to be called a writer, and justifying the hopes placed upon him. And at the same time, thoughts about the sinfulness of literature circulated in his mind. What if Father Matvey was right? What if everything he wrote was empty vanity, pride, serving not God but the devil? What if Dead Souls was not a great work but a source of temptation that corrupted readers? These thoughts were unbearable, but they would not let go. They tormented him day and night, preventing him from sleeping, working, or living. Gogol was in a state of permanent psychological crisis, on the verge of madness. Moscow of 1852 met him in this state, sick in body and soul, tormented by contradictions, entangled in his own convictions. The manuscript of the second volume lay in his room, a thick stack of scribbled pages, the fruit of many years of labor and torment. But did it bring him satisfaction? No. He was still dissatisfied, still wanted to revise, improve, and bring it to perfection. And the time for this was rapidly running out. The year 1852 began anxiously. The winter in Moscow was cold and snowy. Gogol lived with Tolstoy, hardly left the house, worked on his manuscripts, and prayed for long periods. Friends saw that something was wrong with him, but they couldn't grasp how serious the situation was. And then, at the end of January, an event occurred that became the final blow for him. Ekaterina Mikhailovna Khomyakova, the wife of the famous Slavophile, died. Gogol knew her, deeply revered her as an example of true Christian virtue. For him, she was the living embodiment of the ideal he strove for in life and in art. And suddenly this person, young and full of vigor, departed from life. This shock proved unbearable for him. He perceived Khomyakova's death as a sign from above, as a warning of his own impending demise. In his sick imagination, everything became mixed up: the fear of death, thoughts of sins, doubts about his creative work. He began telling friends that he would die soon, that he felt the end approaching. On the 11th of February, in the evening, he prayed for a long time in his room. Then he called his servant and ordered him to light the fireplace. It was strange. It was freezing outside. The house was already warm, so why was fire needed? But the servant carried out the order, and then Gogol took a briefcase containing manuscripts from the closet. On the night of the 11th to the 12th of February, he burned the second volume of Dead Souls. That very volume he had worked on for more than 10 years. Thousands of pages of paper covered in small handwriting, the fruit of countless revisions, sleepless nights, and mental suffering. All of it went into the fire. Imagine this scene: deep night, the fire blazes in the fireplace, and Gogol methodically throws his work in, sheet after sheet. The paper flares up, blackens, and turns to ash. With every page, images, dialogues, and descriptions disappear. Everything that was supposed to become his main work, the justification for his entire life. In the morning, when the owners of the house found out what had happened, it was already too late. Gogol sat pale and indifferent. When asked why he did it, he answered something incoherent about the enemy misleading him, that he burned the wrong thing. But was that the truth? Or was he trying to justify himself to his friends, unwilling to admit that he had done it consciously, obeying an inner voice that told him literature was a sin? After that night, he completely broke down. He stopped eating entirely, even the crumbs he subsisted on before. He said that God commanded him to fast, that he needed to prepare for death. Friends begged him to eat something, but he refused. He weakened before their eyes, wasted away, turning into a shadow. Doctors were called, the best Moscow physicians. They examined him, consulted, and argued. Various diagnoses were made: nervous exhaustion, melancholy, madness. They tried to treat him with bloodletting, leeches, and cold ablutions. This was the medicine of that time, cruel and often meaningless. The sick man, who could barely stand anymore, was covered with ice to cool the feverish brain. Leeches were applied, releasing the already meager remnants of his blood. They forcibly tried to pour broth into his mouth, but he clenched his teeth and turned away. These attempts at treatment only hastened the end. He lay in bed, barely regaining consciousness. Sometimes he raved, shouting something indistinct. Friends kept vigil at his bedside, hoping for a miracle, but the miracle did not happen. On the 21st of February, in the morning, Nikolai Vasilievich Gogol died. He was only 42 years old, an age when the creative flourishing of many writers only begins. And he passed away without completing his main concept, without realizing what he had lived for in his final years. The news of the writer's death shook Moscow and St. Petersburg. He was buried ceremoniously. Hundreds of people came to see off the great writer on his last journey. He was buried in the cemetery of the Holy Danilov Monastery, under the shade of old trees. Later, when the monastery was closed, the remains were transferred to Novodevichy Cemetery, where he rests to this day. Immediately after his death, legends began to circulate. They said that Gogol did not die a natural death, that the doctors killed him with their barbaric treatment. Terrible stories were told that he was buried alive, that he had fallen into a lethargic sleep and was mistaken for dead. When the grave was opened many years later during reburial, someone present claimed that the skull in the coffin was not lying as it should have been, as if the deceased had tried to turn over. Of course, these are all legends, spawned by the tragedy of his death and people's inclination toward mystification. Most likely, Gogol died from exhaustion, from voluntary starvation, exacerbated by depression and incorrect treatment. He killed himself, slowly, painfully, without consciously intending it, but also without resisting death. Gogol's tragedy is the tragedy of an unrealized concept. He dreamed of creating a great work that would show Russia the path to revival. But the higher he set the bar, the harder it was to reach. He wanted to be not just a writer, but a teacher, a prophet, and this desire crushed him under its weight. And yet, despite this tragic finale, Gogol remained in history as one of the greatest Russian writers. What he created, Evenings on a Farm, The Inspector General, the first volume of Dead Souls, the St. Petersburg Tales, these are pinnacles of Russian literature. His laughter, his grotesque, his ability to see the absurdity of life while maintaining a warm, almost tender attitude toward it, all of this became the foundation of Russian culture. An entire tradition stemmed from him, that very Gogolian line of Russian literature, with its attention to the small man, its social sharpness, and its specific humor where laughter is mixed with sadness. Dostoevsky said that all Russian writers came out of Gogol's The Overcoat, and that is the truth. Thus ended the life of a man who was born in the Ukrainian heartland, dreamed of great achievements, experienced triumphs and catastrophes, struggled with himself, and lost that struggle. But what he left behind lives on and will live forever.